Great to see some folks from Kiev today, right? That was pretty great. You know, last time I was there, I think it was about 4 years ago, and I was walking through the main square, the Medine, there in the center of the city. Absolutely beautiful. And a guy with a gun actually walked up and held me up, and he said, "Your money or your life?" And I live in Brooklyn, so I thought it was awfully courteous. They gave me a choice. So he held me up. He said, "Your money or your life?" And I was like, "Hey, man, I'm a programmer at a startup. I have no money and I have no life." I'm kidding, of course. Kiev is an absolutely beautiful city, in no small part to the wonderful hospitality of all the people there. So if you ever have the opportunity to visit, I highly recommend it. So my name is Rob. I'm going to be talking a little bit about hacking human trafficking about for the next 10 minutes. We'd like to thank JMO and the rest of the Legal Hackers crew for having me by for your international summit. It's definitely a distinct pleasure to be able to join such a vibrant community of innovators here in Brooklyn. Obviously, some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today is a little graphic and a little heavy, so if it makes you feel uncomfortable, this is absolutely a safe zone. Feel free to excuse yourself. There's a lot of other refreshments over in the other room. So first, probably the best place to start is talk a little bit about the problem and provide some shared definition for what we call human trafficking. Now, when most people think of human trafficking, they think of Liam Neeson and the Taken movies. This is actually great for me because my Irish mother thinks I'm a Jedi as opposed to a computer programmer. So that's super helpful. But I think a lot of the misconception doesn't necessarily come from the film, right, or the popularity of, or the pop culture depiction of this problem space. I think the problem really comes from the unproductive euphemism that we use to describe the crime, right? Human trafficking, according to the Palermo Protocol, which is the internationally accepted definition, is not smuggling people from one place to another. It's the involuntary labor compelled through force, fraud, or coercion. It's anybody that is working, doing anything without compensation, and that labor is compelled through force, fraud, or coercion. So this could take a number of different manifestations, right? The one that I think would be most common to this audience are folks that are packed up from developing nations and shipped to developed nations and sold either for labor or sex. Trafficking takes the form of sweatshops that produce the sneakers that you're wearing. They can take the form of a uncompensated illegal immigrant who's washing the dishes at your favorite restaurant, or it can take the form of a abusive spouse withholding the wages of the person that they're with. It can also be take the form of a woman willfully engaged in prostitution, finally having enough and leaving her pimp, and then simply walking across the street and getting surrounded by 8 other pimps in a position that they call in the street as out of pocket. So you see the victim in this particular case is trying to cover her face. The reason why she's trying to cover her face is she doesn't want to make eye contact with any of the pimps. According to the mores of that particular subculture, as soon as she makes eye contact with any of those pimps, she belongs to them. Now, it doesn't matter that those 8 guys think that that's the case. All you got to do is look at that video and that woman holding her face in her hands to know that she believes that's the case. And that is the real definition of human trafficking, right? People who honestly believe they are the property of other folks. That's why I say trafficking is an unproductive euphemism, right? A lot of people call human trafficking modern slavery. There's not a fucking thing modern about it, right? So with a bit of shared definition, let's describe the problem a little more fully. A lot of the reason why it's so difficult to even define human trafficking is because there's not a globally accepted entity that is working on this problem, right? There's no Avengers working on human trafficking. In fact, the data around human trafficking can be very difficult to get. This is a graph from the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime Policy. What you're seeing here is that only 30%, that's 29%, less than a third, of all the nations in the United Nations have had at least 10 convictions for human trafficking in the past year. That is to say, 70% of the 197 member states of the United Nations haven't even prosecuted 10 of these crimes so far. In most of the nations where there have been no convictions at all, it's because it's not even a distinct crime. Obviously, the problem is exacerbated naturally by the globalization of the economy, right? This is a graph that describes some of the prevailing trends of trafficking when there's movement of human beings from one location to another. This particular map describes human beings, but this particular map could describe clothing, it could describe grain, it could describe oil, it could describe shoes. It could describe any commodity that is being transacted in the global economy. This one happens to be humans. But the fact that so much of the supply comes from other parts of the world doesn't mean that the problem isn't itself local in the United States. For the folks that are here in the United States, this is a heat map of all the victims that have texted in to the Polaris Project's Be Free shortcode. There's a small shortcode called Be Free that any victim can text into in order to get connected with local services that will get that victim out of life. And this is a heat map representing where all those victims were from. And once you take a look at that map, it becomes very clear the scope of the problem in the United States. Right? This is not just a New York problem. This is not just a San Francisco problem. This is a Fort Wayne, Indiana problem. This is a Columbus, Ohio problem. This is a Minneapolis, Minnesota problem. And how does that problem exist? How can it persist? Is on the backs of roughly 21 million victims around the world. And those 21 million victims are being milked for a ton of money, and that's what's primarily driving the growth. This is taken from the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children. It's the main NGO in the United States that works with runaway youth. They described in 2014 that 1 in 6 of the runaways that they were working with, 1 in 6 underage runaways that they were providing service to were involved in sex trafficking in some way. In 2015, a year later, that dropped to 1 in 5. So at the very most base level, and not just over the past decade, over the past few years, this is an area of crime that has been exploding. And it's been fueled basically by 3 things. The first one is a lot of money. This is an example of some of the assets that were recently seized on an investigation from last year. And that represents a small part of the estimated $150 billion, with a B, dollars in profit that human trafficking drives globally. To put that amount of money in perspective, if you took the top 5 companies in the entire world in terms of profitability and stacked them beside that, it would only be a pittance of the amount of money that human trafficking drives worldwide. By the way, 3 of these companies basically represent the entire financial industry of China. And only when you stack those 5 companies on top of each other do you even get in the neighborhood of the scope monetarily of this problem. If you wanted to use something that was a little more familiar, like a consumer brand that you would recognize here in the United States, you would have to take the annual profit of Apple, of Microsoft, of Google, of IBM, of Cisco, of General Electric, of Disney, Boeing, Coca-Cola, and Toyota, and you still wouldn't reach $150 billion. In order to push it over the line, you would have to take the combined payroll of the New York Yankees from 2001 to today. Pretty scary amount of money involved. How that money gets acquired is through super cheap distribution. So if I was going to go into Brooklyn today and try to buy a kilo of cocaine, the street value is about $34,000, right? So the capital requirements to conduct that particular kind of illicit business are high. In order for me to place a back page ad in the dating section of that website right now, it costs me $3. The only thing I need to have is the ability to access Bitcoin. So the capital requirements are low. The amount of money that it generates is about the same. And the third and most aggravating factor that's driving the growth of this particular illicit economy is the fact that no one gets caught. So this was taken from an Urban Institute study that was published last year. It was a great qualitative study that talked directly with 16 self-identified traffickers, all of whom said one of the primary reasons why they were engaged in that illicit trade was because it was less risky than other illicit forms of money acquisition, like selling drugs or selling weapons, right? The prevailing wisdom that no one gets locked up for pimping is further reinforced by the data. So the State Department in 2017 purchased their annual Persons in Trafficking report. This is an example of the trend line of all the prosecutions that have occurred in the Western Hemisphere from 2010 to today. This is the number of convictions. So if you walk into a courtroom in New York and you get caught with a kilo of coke, you're going to the pokey 8 out of 10 times. If you were trafficking drugs, you go to jail 80% of the time, right? If you were trafficking a human being, it's basically a coin flip. And that's the source of the problem today. Now, in the face of all this data, I can see a whole lot of somber faces, and it would be very natural for you to despair once you start to comprehend the overall magnitude and scope of this problem. But I do firmly believe it's one that can be hacked. And it's one that you all can help with as soon as you get home, and I'd like to talk about that for a bit. So my name is Rob Spectre. I'm a software developer here in the best borough in the greatest city in the world, Brooklyn, New York. I've been volunteering in this issue space for the past 4 years, but since January I've been working on this full-time with some of the agencies that are listed up on the screen. And we'll talk a bit about how you can hack human trafficking. So the old way that you would pursue this particular issue in the dragnet days is the same way that you would pursue narcotics. You would go out, find a low-level dealer, pressure them, get them to flip on a higher-level dealer, and so on until you get to like El Guapo or something. Obviously, that doesn't work in this particular case. However, there are two places where you can find a lot of information on this. One, all the services that are being provided through trafficking are marketed online, and they are transacted over SMS, which gives us a great opportunity. So the hack for human trafficking is getting data from the economy's media to disrupt the distribution and supply and build cases without witness testimony. We have a few case studies that I'd be happy to provide. We're kind of running out of time, so we got to move on to some of the other programming that you have available. But some of these are based on using the advertising that's online to provide probable cause to get search warrants for the SMS traffic that occurs. Absolutely no defense attorney has been able to make an SMS transcript cry on the stage or on the stand so far, and that produced a significant conviction. Another trafficker, which was featured on America's Most Wanted, in fact, publicized such online, was using a series of burner phones and Google Voice to try to obscure the origin of the SMS traffic that was occurring. Using a cloud service called Twilio Lookup, we were able to determine which phone numbers were the ones that we needed to tap. That produced an arrest in 2015 and produced a conviction that has yet to be sentenced, but is looking at 100 to life. How do you mute? How do you mute this thing? Oh, gosh. All right. And finally, labor trafficking. This is something that's a lot more difficult to find than sex trafficking. Obviously, sex trafficking has a retail component to its economy that's immediately observable online. Usually, with labor trafficking today, tragically, the only time that you find out about this is when it's entirely too late. But there are some ways that we can use public data to hack this as well. In New York, one of the specific parts of the restaurant inspection code has a prohibition conviction for sleeping quarters being next to food preparation. That's usually a clear indication that the people that are working on preparing the food are doing so under duress and against their will. And all that information is available online. So by doing a quick search of all the restaurants where sleeping quarters were located, we were able to connect our trafficking unit with each of those folks and start working through them one by one to determine whether or not labor trafficking was taking place. No convictions on that yet, but some really, really fun stuff coming up. So in conclusion, human trafficking, huge problem. There are some clever ways that you can hack it by going to the mediums where they're located and grabbing the data around them and using that to produce convictions and take these terrible people off the street forever. If you'd like to learn more, the slides are up there, and obviously I'll be around for the rest of the day. Thank you all, legal hackers, for having me by.